Okay, so our speaker today is Professor Geoff Levermore from University of Manchester, who is, I've got down in my notes here, an emeritus professor of the built environment and quite an expert on all sorts of matters to do with climate change, and has worked on, with the IPCC. So he's going to be giving you a presentation in a moment of about 40 minutes, depending on how much he talks for. But I also, those of you who emailed me for the instructions, I've also emailed you all an article that was quite interesting that was written on BBC website, Future Planet, called The Law That Could Make Climate Change Illegal. So that might have already got some of you thinking and get you thinking about questions that you want to ask around this topic. So like I said, as he talks, if you think of any questions, either write them down or write them in the chat box. And at the end of the talk, at the end of the presentation, you've got an opportunity to ask any questions you've got then. If we don't, we probably won't have time to get through all the questions you might have. And if we don't, that's fine. We'll keep a log of them in the chat box and we save a copy of that. And maybe we can email you back some of those answers later if we don't get a chance to answer all the questions that everybody's got. Good. So let me hand over to Geoff and he can introduce himself.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kat. I'll go to the presentation. That's right. And right. Okay. So thank you for inviting me, Kat, and thanks everybody for coming along and listening to me. I'm going to be talking about climate change, and I've been involved in climate change for about 20 years now, especially with the built environment, because it's so important to actually make sure our buildings are efficient. But my talk's going to be about climate change, the latest news, and climate change looking at the UK here, the US and China, and a little bit on what you said about Denmark, and coal being the worst fossil fuel, and then a bit about this climate science, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the importance of building and food emissions, and climate change ethics, and also COVID-19. So to start off with, looking at the latest news, there's been a Siberian heatwave with clear evidence of warming. And this is people that have been at the Hadley Centre, which is our Met Office, which does a lot of excellent work on climate change and forecasting and scenarios. And the temperature, surprisingly, in Siberia is 38 degrees C, a record temperature on the 20th of June 2020. And the researchers realised this must be human-induced climate change because there's a 1 in 800,000 chance of this happening if it was random. So this has happened, and they're seriously putting this down to climate change. It's also very worrying that the Arctic's believed to be warming at twice as fast as global average. And of course, there's also a fair amount of methane in the permafrost in this area. Methane is an even worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Also, there are stories about insects could vanish within a century at current rate of decline, says a global review. And that was reported in 2019. So there's a lot to be worried about. And rightly, Extinction Rebellion has come along, and Greta Thunberg. And I think that they've really raised the profile so that it's really got back into the news again, and good for them. And I think this is the youngsters actually pushing the oldest like me to actually do something. Now, one thing they say, or two things they say, are net zero carbon emissions by 2025, a very over-optimistic hope, but one's got to have something to aim for. But they've also spoken about a citizens' assembly to oversee the changes. And it's very interesting that when we had the governments, the minority, well, when Theresa May had a very small majority in Parliament, the parliamentarians did actually vote for having a citizens' assembly. And this has actually been held and is still ongoing. And they recently produced an interim briefing. And it said that 79% of assembly members strongly agreed that steps taken by the government to help the economy recover should be designed to help achieve net zero emissions. And 93% of the assembly members strongly agreed that the government, employers and/or others should take steps to encourage lifestyles to change to be more compatible with reaching net zero. I think this climate change and the Citizens' Assembly is a very good idea. It first emerged in Ireland, and they used it for whether Ireland should have the abortion bill. And it was surprising that a large number of the Citizens' Assembly people agreed that it should. And sure enough, Parliament went that way. And it's a very good way of seeing what people that are selected randomly to represent the general population of a country actually think about something. And it's presented with views of professional people that are experts in those areas. An excellent idea. And I hope it has more power to come. There's also the Energy Act in this country, which came in 2008. And that establishes a legally binding target, net zero by 2050 now. And there's also a Committee on Climate Change, the CCC. And that produces a lot of very good reports, actually. And it's an independent expert body. And it submits annual reports to Parliament on progress. And for instance, the fourth carbon budget actually was put into law. And it says reduced by 50% from 1990 levels by 2025. So we're not too far away from that. And here we've got that budget. So although it looks fairly good, my dear colleague, Professor Kevin Anderson, who I think has a joint post in Manchester and in Sweden, and has been, I think, advising Greta, says that even climate progressive nations fall far short of the Paris Agreement targets. Now, the target is that we should try and achieve only 1.5 degrees C rise above pre-industrial levels of temperature. And we've already gone through almost 1 degree C already. And Kevin's very, he's produced a paper, and it says that the UK's net zero strategy implies a carbon budget 2 to 3 times greater than is required to deliver the Paris Agreement. So if we stick to these strategies, then he's suggesting that it's going to be 2.5 to 3 degrees rather than 1.5 to 2 that we're after. And he's also saying we should be trying to achieve a fully zero carbon energy system by around 2035. So we can't be complacent. And if we look at our emissions, indeed they are coming down. But look at aviation, transport and F-gases. They are fairly steady. The F-gases is for air conditioning and likewise other things that need refrigeration, commercial and industrial, apart from straightforward air conditioning for buildings. And I think that just looking at the air conditioning, a lot of people are saying, well, it's becoming more and more efficient, but with the population rise and people wanting air conditioning in very hot climates, Africa, India and China, they reckon that by 2050, the demand for air conditioning will be 4 times what it is at present. So technology might be improving very well, but you've just got the numbers game, and you just got to look at the population and how it's going to increase. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And Denmark, which Kat mentioned, has just passed an ambitious climate policy. The country's new Climate Act aims to ensure that Denmark will reduce its carbon emissions by 70% in 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And the law also aims to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, the same as the UK. And they have an action plan each year to meet these targets. So it's perhaps a bit more stringent than the system we've got here. but I think a lot of governments are coming around to that. But it's, as Kevin Anson said, a lot of countries are not going to achieve it. In this country, Rishi Sunak has brought in a £30 billion coronavirus package. And there we can see green homes at £2 billion. And up here, we've got decarbonising public sector buildings, 1.1 billion. Now, this is very good, but if we compare this with what happens in Germany, they are going to be investing 103 billion euros in looking at hydrogen for the energy generating companies and electric cars, really putting a lot of money into development. And I think this is what this government should be doing. And I just hope it will. But with politicians, a lot of them aren't scientists. But note in Germany, we've got Angela Merkel, who's got a PhD in physics. And I think we're finding that it's a great problem these days that you've got a lot of politicians, and in COVID, they just do not understand the science or the mathematics behind it. And here's a classic example of a climate denier, Donald Trump, who said that the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Now, okay, there is something about increasing the competition for the Chinese, but at the end of the day, this is absolute nonsense. And there's also the war on science, that they're denying it. And we've got to be very careful, because this is the only truth we can really rely on. Yet we have Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, vowed to protect the landmark Paris Agreement. So China is doing a lot of good things. We've also got to be very, very wary of Xi Jinping's power. And when I was last in China, and I apologize, I've got a dreadful carbon footprint, one of my hosts actually thought about Xi Jinping. And I said there were good things, and also the West had some reservations about him. And then my other host said, oh, for goodness sake, don't say that in the lecture. I said, don't worry, don't worry. But if we look at China, we can actually see that they've got a lot of wind production, which is brilliant. They've also got solar power. So they are the leaders in renewables, but they've got a lot of people who don't have electricity. And the cheapest way of getting that is through coal. And when we look at this, if we're looking at trying to achieve 2 degrees C, and remember we want 1.5 now, if we want a 50% probability not to exceed 2 degrees C, we have to leave 2/3 of our fossil fuels in the ground. And this was a paper by Paul Ekins in Nature, a very good paper. And there we are, we've got to leave 82% of the coal in the ground, 49% of the gas, and 33% of the oil, if we're going to try and achieve this. Now, people might say, well, we're running out of fossil fuels anyway. We certainly are not. This is the BP projection for the year 2050. And the white line there, the little bit there, is 2.5 trillion barrels of oil equivalent. The projected oil and gas demand in 2050. But this line around here, this circle, which goes 3/4 of the way round, is actually what the reserves are and what they can actually get out of the ground with new technology. And that is 3 times the amount of fuel we would need in 2050. So there certainly is not a running out of fuel at all. We've got to leave it in the ground. Now, one of those things is coal. And if we look at China's coal production for energy, we see that most of the energy actually comes from that coal. That is the red there. The hydro and other renewables, and oil is down here. And yellow is the natural gas. Now, a simple thing is that, as Professor Dieter Helm of Oxford University has said, UK emissions are going down. because China is emitting the carbon dioxide for us for making the goods we actually buy. So it's not surprising that our carbon emissions are going down, because we're purchasing things from China and India, and their carbon emissions are going up. So we should include their emissions in what we do and what we're buying. And he recommends, and I think the European Union are considering this, a carbon border tax. So we pay for all the carbon we emit. Now, if China used gas, not coal, for electricity, it would reduce China's contribution to the world's emission of carbon dioxide from 28%, almost a third, to 14%, because gas emits only about half the amount of carbon dioxide than coal. Coal is a dreadful fuel to burn. And if we can get them onto gas, an interesting thing is that they've got the world's largest reserves of shale gas. And in America, they're using a lot of shale gas as well. And they're not using much coal at all, but they are exporting the coal, and coal is becoming cheaper. But the thing is that some of the coal companies in the States are going into liquidation. Now, if we look further into the science, we can see that carbon dioxide is increasing. And we've known for about 150 years that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's just like a conservatory with glass. It lets the shortwave radiation from the sun in, and it stops the long-wave radiation going out, which means it heats up because of that radiation effect. And it's just like having a greenhouse. And we can see there that since 1960, when they started measurements in Mauna Loa Observatory, that regularly the carbon dioxide is increasing. The sawtooth is there but simply for the fact that most of it is emitted in the northern hemisphere, and you've got the seasons of winter and summer and what happens with the vegetation. And this is the greenhouse effect. Now, before I go through this diagram, the solar constant, this is the amount of solar irradiance that's hitting the Earth at the top of the atmosphere. And it's 68 watts per meter squared. Now notice that the world consumption is 1.4 times 10 to 14 kilowatt hours. And solar insolation can actually be 7.6 times 10 to 17. So if we used all the sunshine, we've got more than enough that we could use for the power we need. But a lot of that goes into the weather. We can't just take all the sunshine. But if we did put solar panels, for instance, in the Sahara Desert, we could provide most of the electricity for Africa and quite a bit for Southern Europe as well, if we had a superconducting DC link under the Mediterranean. But that is future, and it's very, very expensive to do that. But here we can see the solar radiation absorbed by the Earth coming down. Some of it's going into the atmosphere where there's carbon dioxide and other gases. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas, but it's regularly going in and coming out. It's not going to stay there for 100 years like carbon dioxide. What we're burning today is going to affect our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And this is the greenhouse factor here, that it's recirculating that. And we can see that it's the average temperature of the Earth's surface is about 14 degrees, say, over the whole of the Earth. If we didn't have the greenhouse effect, it would be about -18. So it's good that we've got the greenhouse effect, but too much of it and we just get too hot. And there are also climate projections for the future, and the recent ones come out, the UKCP Climate Projection 18 in 2018. And we can see here that the temperature is going to get pretty high in Britain. And down here, we're talking about the end of the century, it could get up to about 7 degrees C. And this is if we don't do very much to stop it, and all the problems that could produce. Now, people think, well, the forcing due to these greenhouse gas emissions is very small. It's actually, in this example, 0.6 watts per meter squared. And James Hansen actually said that although that's pretty small, and most people would dismiss it, and they'd say, well, 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, very, very small. But when you put it over the whole of the Earth, this is equivalent to 413,152 Hiroshima bombs a day going off. Now, I put that figure there to so many figures, but I didn't believe James Hansen. So I did the calculation myself, and that figure is what I came up with. So I validated it. Now, the thing is that 0.6 watts per meter squared is well below what the future scenarios are, because here are the future scenarios of what people think will happen. And it starts off here in about 2000 at about 2, and up here, which is the worst scenario, is getting on for about 9. So in actual fact, you've got far more atomic bombs going off every day with climate change, the heat that's going into the atmosphere from us, the human beings, than it has been there. So, and these are some of the scenarios, and we're talking about temperatures here of going up to about 5.4 degrees C, the worst type of scenario. I won't go into the details of these, but basically looking at carbon emissions. And you can see there are a lot of lines here because there are many scenarios, all of which are equally unlikely. You can't put your finger on one particular temperature. There are many different scenarios because we know the meteorology, the differential equations for that are well established. But how we solve those and how close the nets are, the grid that we use, how small we divide the Earth up into, how powerful our computer is, also has an input to it. But we know the physics pretty well. But we've got the population. What's the population going to be at the end of this century? And here are 3 possible scenarios. And population is a major driver for this, because if I emit so many kilograms of carbon dioxide and you average this over the population, one extra person is going to produce that much more X kilograms of carbon dioxide. So population and population growth is something that we've got to look at. And the overall population of the world is going up, even though in some Western countries it's slowly declining. Also, how wealthy will people be in the future? The GDP. And some people say, oh, they'll be much wealthier in the future. They'll be able to sort out these problems. Well, unfortunately, if the polar ice caps have disappeared, there's no way that they can bring back the polar bear that's probably extinct by then. Money is not the solution to everything. Now, we put that together, these scenarios of all these things, and there's a graph showing 58 simulations from 14 different climate models, and these come from different researchers, and they're all slightly different because researchers always think that their model is better. But if we look at this, the yellow is the result of running all these simulations, and the average of them is the red line there, and the black line there is actually on previous data. We know what has happened to the temperatures in the past because it's all being recorded. So that model, these models follow this quite well. And notice it's talking about temperature anomalies. That just means the difference between the set point, which in this case is about 0 in 1900. Now, if weather was a random process, we'd have that white line, sorry, the yellow lines going more or less up and down about 0, a horizontal line there, but we haven't. Weather is chaotic, but chaos can have a trend, and here we can see the trend. So we're pretty certain that this is increasing and that this is pretty well modeled by these models. But with the scenarios on population and GDP, and also what the technology is going to be, it's not a simple thing to predict the future. But all this is reviewed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is presided over by Lee Ho-sung from South Korea. And its role is to assess technical and socioeconomic information on climate change, its impacts and options for adaptation when it's happened and what we can do, and mitigation to try and stop the emissions of these carbon emissions. And the IPCC is not to research or monitor the climate data on its own. It is purely the assessment of peer-reviewed literature. Now, this is really important because the wonderful thing about science is that you have to produce, if you have a great idea, you write what we call an academic paper. And that paper you want to get published. And the publishers will say, well, we don't know whether you've made a mistake or not. We will put it out to 3 or 4 referees who can review that. And they can actually say what they think because they remain anonymous. You don't know who the referees are. You've got a good idea sometimes, but academics love pulling other people's work apart. So it's a wonderful method of actually making sure that stupid papers or papers with simple mistakes don't get through. Occasionally they do, but this is a really good way. Now compare this with a lot of other information that comes through newspapers. And there it can be the opinion of a journalist. And some journalists don't even have a GCSE in physics, chemistry, or geography. And they feel they can comment on climate change, which indeed they can. But why take that opinion into account when it's based on not much knowledge and sometimes wrong facts? So this, again, is the importance of science and this peer-reviewed literature. So, and they produce their reports, and they're huge reports, and they do them very regularly. And I was involved with the 4th assessment report in 2007, and much to our surprise, it got the Nobel Peace Prize along with Al Gore. And then in 2013, another one was produced. Another one is coming out shortly. Now, there's also been a report saying that we shouldn't look at 2 degrees as the really damaging point of climate change. We should bring it back to 1.5. And this is where we're trying to aim for now, to make sure we can get to 1.5, which is going to be a very, very difficult task. And this information all goes to the Meeting of Nations. And in 2021, the UN Climate Change Conference, or they call it the Conference of Parties, it's the 26th such conference, will be held in 2021 under the presidency of the UK government. So hopefully the UK government will take this seriously and get countries together so we can get some agreement. This is all under the United Nations, and it's such a wonderful organisation because we have to act in the world together. There is no way that individual countries can go their separate ways because one person's carbon emissions affect everybody in the world, whether they're rich or whether they're poor. And it's very similar with COVID, that we have to act together. And the way the Americans are going and pulling out of the World Health Organization, some of them don't like the United Nations. That's very, very worrying. The interesting thing is I was involved with the 4th assessment report. And one of the graphs that really I was interested in was that buildings have a great potential to save greenhouse gas emissions. Here it is. It's more than energy supply, more than transport, more than industry, more than agricultural, forestry, or waste. So with making sure our buildings and our built environment, which in the end produce about 1/3 of the emissions with the electricity and the gas that are used in them, 1/3 of the emissions in the world. So if we can get efficient building stock, then that goes a long way to helping to save the planet from climate change. And one of the buildings I was involved with in Germany was this net zero energy office building, the NZ building, which was in the Ruhr area. And that did actually manage to have, with PV cells and good controls, good renewable energy, it could produce more energy than it used. It's only just, but that is quite a good start. I'm also interested in the urban heat island. And this is where it's slightly hotter at night time, especially in the center of the city, than it is out in the rural area. So then we have to add this on to the climate change. So people living in cities, and perhaps people to move out of cities a lot more after COVID, a very interesting question that would be, that you've got to add on perhaps 4 or 5 degrees when it's going to be really hot and we're in a heat wave. But now I'm coming on to something quite important, because we can actually look back over what's happened in past climates. And this is from the British Antarctic Survey, courtesy of Dr. Robert Mulvaney. And they can dig down, because when it snows in Antarctica, it doesn't melt. And snow lays on snow, lays on snow. So you end up with it, by the pressure, it ends up as ice. But you end up with ice that's a few kilometers thick. But when you get drilled down and you take out the ice cores, then you take a slice off. That actually is showing you the atmosphere at that time, because we can see there are little bubbles in there, bubbles of air, and you can analyze that in quite great detail. So we've got traces of air that go back hundreds of thousands of years. And that can be analysed. Now, this is quite complicated, but carbon has got a number of isotopes, one of which is carbon-13. And evolution has meant that photosynthesis has changed slightly from the Carboniferous age, when our fossil fuels were laid down, to the carbon that is naturally emitted into the atmosphere now. So we can actually, looking at this carbon-13 ratio to carbon-12, I think about 99.9% is carbon-12, we can actually see how much carbon dioxide we have put into the atmosphere. And they call it a smoking gun. Now, it's a logarithmic graph, and it goes down to show that we're putting more fossil fuel into the atmosphere. And we can see that on this graph on the left, it starts going down about here, which is about 1750. And what happened then? The Industrial Revolution in the UK. And we can see how it's going down since then. So that is showing us directly what we are putting into the atmosphere, and showing the carbon emissions that are going up here. So we know what mankind is putting into the atmosphere. No ifs or buts. It's very clear cut, although it's a difficult graph to get over to the average people. And we can see, going back over 700,000 years in the Antarctic, that the temperature of the Earth has gone up and down, and so has the carbon dioxide, and they're more or less in sync. This is an early graph, and today the carbon dioxide is well above 400 parts per million. And we can see the temperature there. And people say, well, in the past we've always had high periods of temperature and low periods, and we've had the ice age. Nothing new in what's happening now. Well, but this can be explained by the Millennium cycle, and this is due to the position of the Earth, its precession, and its tilt, and its eccentricity. So those variations before can be explained, but the only explanation for carbon emissions going up is the fact that it's man-made emissions. Now, one of the important things with climate change is food. And this is something that impinges on us all. And my colleague at Manchester University, Sarah Bridle, is going to write a book on carbon emissions and food and climate change. I don't know how she's getting on with it, but hopefully it'll be published soon. And she's got some very interesting figures. One of which, if we look at this, the greenhouse gas emissions per serving of food, we can see that if we have lamb or beef, those are the emissions there. And if it's pork, it's there. And if it's poultry, it's there. And this is the fish. But if we go down to cereals, fruit, and sugar and oil, if we become vegan, we can save quite a lot of the emissions. Not from emissions from ourselves, but emissions from the cows, because ruminant animals actually emit a lot of methane. And methane is worse than carbon dioxide. So we might see less cows and sheep around. And I think that it's not so bad in this country with farming. It's really also thinking about where they knock down tropical rainforests to make it arable for the cows to graze on that to produce steaks for people. There's also the ethics in climate change, because the world's richest 10% produce half the emissions, and the poorest 50% account for just a tenth. So the poor will be greatest affected by this, and the rich could carry on emitting things. And of course, the poor countries that are really going to be affected are going to be some in South America, some in Africa, especially around here. One of my students is the energy minister now in Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in Africa, and they're desperately trying to put in photovoltaics. And then there's also China and India that are also going to be affected here. So ethics and morality come in that I think the Christian religion says treat others the way that you would want to be treated, the golden rule. There's also the platinum rule that treat others the way that they want to be treated. And then there's Kant's rule, which effectively says you should treat others as all should be treated. And I think Kant gets it about right. Now, people would say in this country, oh, well, the population's so small, we hardly make any difference. Very true. But if we look at our emissions, we can see that they're rising up slightly, but they're nothing like those in the USA or India or China. Again, very true. But the fairest way is to say, what are our emissions per person? And look, there's us in the UK and there's those in the US against India, China and the world. These countries have got huge populations, but there's a lot of poverty. And the last thing we can say is that you cannot have the standard of living we have, because standard of living and energy consumption are correlated. We're slowly breaking that, but the fact is that if we're going to negotiate with the Chinese and the Indians to get world agreement, we've actually got to think that we've got to make sacrifices ourselves. So we are all neighbours in the world. We all share the atmosphere, rich and poor. And that could be what they call cap and convergence, but I'll not go into details of that. We've recently had COVID. We can see that a chance to change, a crisis gives opportunity. There are less offices used. There's less air travel. The oil price is down. BP are looking at what they can do on renewables because they know that their money coming in from oil is going to be reducing. And Germany have invested in the greener world, hydrogen EV cars, electric vehicles and cars. And I think the UK should do the same. And indeed, the Climate Change Committee that advises our government and is saying how we can get to 2050 with zero consumption. He says the UK is facing its biggest economic shock for a generation. And the global crisis of climate change is accelerating. We have a once-in-a-chance lifetime opportunity to address these urgent challenges together. And rebuilding from the COVID-19 pandemic can accelerate the transition to a successful low-carbon economy and improve climate resilience. Choices that lock in emissions or climate risks are unacceptable. So in conclusion, we can see that climate change is happening. There's very strong evidence that man is influenced by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Recent action might influence those policies. We could eat less red meat. And many people are deniers of science and selective in their facts. We must keep to the science and educate people and just ram the science there. There's a lot of discussion over science. It's not clear cut. But the way it's going is it's the best way than having just ordinary person's opinions. Addressing China's coal consumption is important. Do we have a solution to that? Ethics and morality are important and vital contributors, but I think we need legislation, and worldwide legislation is required. And we have a golden opportunity to recover from COVID to make a better world. And the final message, somebody gave the story that she was talking to a group of people about this, and she said, who wants change? And many hands shot up. Yeah, want change. Who will change? Not so many hands went up. And then who will help organize change? Very few hands went up. We're all very keen to say we want change, but it's actually getting down and doing things. And the final message, the world will soon be in your hands. You are the younger generation. And make sure that you try and stop this climate change. Thank you. Right, I think I can unshare now.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you. I feel a bit like applauding, actually. Oh, there we are. Lawrence is applauding. That's brilliant. And Callum, that's really, really good. Thank you very much, Geoff. I'm a bit blinded with all the science and the facts.
Yeah, sorry I rabbited on for so long.
No, it's been fantastic. I've learned a lot. I know there were some questions coming up in the chat box. Yeah. But there were some people that emailed in questions beforehand. So I think we'll start with one of those first of all. In fact, have we still got, is Sian here? Yes, she's got her camera off. So I might ask her. Yeah, go on, Sian. Do you want to ask your question first?
I can't remember what my second question is, but I think my first question was, what can we do individually to reduce our own carbon footprint?
That's a very good question, Sian. I think the thing is that we can look at food, and we can also look at the way we use transport. And there, a lot of people are working from home, which will be a good thing. I think the other thing is we can vote. And we can, even if people don't agree with us, I think the thing is that we can tell them the facts. And getting the truth and the facts out is vitally important, especially in these days when we have populist politicians which will almost deny things. And those are the, so be fully aware. I think Extinction Rebellion has done a brilliant job in raising the profile. I think I'm a bit too old to start demonstrating and sitting down the road, but they've done a good start, and I think we've got to capitalise on that. And we've also got to be prepared to sacrifice and pay more for our energy, to pay for renewable energy. But also voting, because it's got to be worldwide, and we've got to have a level playing field. For instance, if we put a tax on kerosene that are used for planes, the planes would simply land in another airport in Europe, fill up with cheaper kerosene, and then fly to Britain, and it wouldn't do much. It is the importance of the United Nations and the IPCC that we do these things, and we get the facts across, and we discuss, and we vote. And in some cases, we don't vote for our own increasing wealth. We've also, I think, got to think of the capitalist system and the money that some of the top dogs get, and looking at fairness in the world, because the people that are going to suffer are going to be the poor. And we think that the capitalist West, yes, but in China, the gap in wealth is enormous. Some of the Communist Party members are rich beyond belief, and I've met them. But how you affect what happens in China is another great question.
That's great. Thank you, Geoff. Right. Gus and Mia asked similar questions. So I'm going to get, is Gus there? Are you happy to unmic yourself, Gus? Unmute yourself, rather. Yeah. Do you want to ask yours? And then Mia, if you ask yours straight after, because they're kind of similar. And then Geoff could answer those.
So let me just try and remember mine.
Do you want me to read it out for you, Gus?
Yes, please.
That's all right. Gus's question was, he said he noticed during lockdown that there were lots of changes in the environment, clearer skies, more wildlife. So do you think this goes to show how quickly a difference could be made? And I think Mia's follows on from that. They're kind of similar. Go on, Mia.
So my question is, in your opinion, why do you think the global community hasn't reacted as powerfully to the immediate climate change threat in contrast to the COVID-19 pandemic, both of which have far-reaching influence on all communities?
I think that the COVID was brought on the changes and the almost semi-legislation, because the hospitals were getting absolutely overwhelmed, and people could actually see something immediately that could kill them. people think, well, climate change is going to be in the future and it won't affect me. I'm okay, Jack, which is true. I mean, we're doing something here that will be killing people in 100 years. What we do now is affecting the atmosphere. And you can't actually see climate change happening in front of your eyes. Whereas COVID, you see those figures of people dying and you do something about it. So they're very similar, but also quite different. The fact that, is it making a difference? Well, we're doing some urban heat island measurements. And we have actually looked at our measurements in Manchester city centre, which is very quiet still. And we've noticed the urban heat island is actually reduced simply for the fact that the buildings aren't operating and there aren't so many cars there. So those are the types of changes you will see. And the temperature hasn't been getting as high and the air has been much cleaner, even in China. But China's now getting back to its polluted air again because they've got out of lockdown. But these are the things that can happen. And I think, although COVID is a terrible thing, and I think it's going to be affecting us for quite some time from now, it means that people are aware of what happens, and that just like the carbon emissions, it's no good us getting rid of COVID in this country if other countries have still got it. And somebody travels in and it can spread so quickly that it might make people realise that we've got to work in a concerted effort around the world. And in China and India, I was in India as well, I apologise, I've got a really poor climate change footprint, but I was talking to youngsters and students out there, and the poverty and the number of people living close together, that life is very cheap in India. And I can see that they just haven't got the resources for the large population of poor to actually deal with it. And they're going to be struggling for a long, long time. So I think it's got to be worldwide effort. And it's got to be a shift of getting more fairness. And the West has got to put money into some of these countries to help them out. Then you come across the problem of the fact that there's corruption. And there is a lot of corruption in India and there is in China.
All right, thanks, Geoff. The other question that was sent in advance was by Guy. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Guy, if you can remember it?
I've put, what is the IPC, hang on, what is the IPCC's view on Boris's build statement, and how that would, how do you think about building nationally and internationally and its impact on climate change?
Well, the first thing is the IPCC doesn't have views. It simply goes through what scientists and engineers have said in the published papers and reports them for governments. So it would not say anything political. And I suppose I am getting slightly political now, that I think Boris Johnson is full of charisma and also he's very good at speaking, but he's not very good at the detail, and we don't know what this build does mean. I've been related to buildings for many years, and if it's going to be more insulation, that's good. But they call it low-hanging fruit, and if it was so low-hanging, why hasn't it been done before? What worries me is that we'll find people putting in better double glazing, more double glazing, and people making quite a lot of money out of that. Whereas loft insulation is by far the better means of saving energy. And insulation around the house, which is not necessarily double glazing. And that's where the marketing kind of hype comes over, and people think that they've got to have very good double glazing. And so this build, we've really got to see what's going to happen. But yeah, there is great potential to reduce the demand, because there are what we call passive houses, which are highly insulated, and they hardly use any energy. But if you let the solar gain in and the sunshine comes in, they get over hot in summer. And it might be the problem that they then have air conditioning. And if we look at buildings, a lot of buildings have air conditioning. We also have air conditioning in most of our cars as well. And we have it on trains. But build, it's really building so that you can make sure that they're using energy efficient resources, and it's using renewables, that you put photovoltaics on buildings, and you have wind turbines around, not the small wind turbines, but big ones. But when we're talking about renewables and it's build, one of the things is that if we're going to have a lot more, the fuel of the future is effectively electricity. Electricity is not a fuel, but we can think of it as. And in the future, there's not going to be coal, gas, or oil. We're going to be on electricity. So we've got to do a lot on the electricity grids and also the suppliers. And we've got to make sure that there are standby generators for when the wind's not blowing and it's night time. So I think that, yeah, we've got to pump a lot of money into the infrastructure. We've got to do a lot to our buildings and our built environment and also our transport system. And to be honest, we're not doing as well as Germany, and I haven't got a lot of faith in Boris's words. I'd like to see a bit more action, but I'm a cynical old devil, I'm afraid. But a very good question.
I have to admit, as someone who works for Wildlife Trust, I'm not keen on the build idea either, but more for ecological reasons, if anything else. There we are.
Well, I think this is the problem with the population, isn't it? People have got to have somewhere to live. Yeah. And I think that you can make cities a lot more happier and greener. And that, so you do have the green areas. Yeah, so it's the question that, you know, population increase, they've got to go somewhere. And we are getting really mega cities.
Yes. Well, this ties in nicely. Our next question time next month actually is on population growth. So hang in there for the next instalment, let's say. Right. I'm just looking at some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, we've got the one down at the top. There's one saying, how is the hydrogen produced? Hydrogen fuel.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that when you've got wind turbines running, sometimes when it's very windy, in this country and other countries, the generating boards that run these things say, well, we don't want that amount of electricity. It's actually supply and demand. So you can have a really windy day, but there's not a great demand for electricity. Now, the thing is that those wind farms still have to be paid for running. And it's quite complicated how you actually control the electricity grid so it's stable. But they will be paid not to generate electricity, which sounds crazy. But you have to have that available if the demand suddenly increases. The classic example, people are watching the cup final, half time, they all go off and have a cup of tea, and they put a 3 kilowatt kettle on. And you can see the spike there. They've got to have the electricity supply ready to meet that. Now, one of the really interesting things is that if those wind turbines, or even the photovoltaics, the PV, if they're producing a lot of electricity in the summer, we don't use a lot of electricity in the summer compared to that in the winter. And you can actually get them producing hydrogen. And it's just as cheap to generate hydrogen as it is for the payments to pay these people. So you could have wind turbines that are producing hydrogen. The hydrogen could be put in the gas network to a certain extent. And it can also be used for travel. You could have a car running on hydrogen. And you can also use either burning it directly, or you could have it in a fuel cell. And I think a lot of people are thinking that hydrogen is possibly the fuel of the future, if we do need that, and we can't always produce the electricity that's required. And they're even thinking of hydrogen planes. But this COVID has really been a death knell of conferences. I mean, I'm as bad as anybody else. If I'm invited to speak in any country, I'll go there to talk. And I have been invited to a number of countries, and it's been very enjoyable meeting people around the world. But those conferences now, we can see that people are getting used to Zoom and Skype and that. And you can have a very good conference as well, having a very good discussion here without having to spend any carbon on travel.
There's another question. Is it possible for a group like the UN or another international group to financially support countries that are currently dependent on fossil fuels?
Probably not. They don't have a lot of money, but I think persuading other countries and introducing a tax, for instance, if the European Union introduced the carbon border tax, so we pay for the carbon that's actually being used in producing the goods we import, then that money could go, for instance, to China and say to the Chinese, we want you to not use any coal and we will help you and pay you to get onto gas and then to get onto more renewables. And it's really part of the redistribution, this fairness that we've got to have around the world. But the difficulty is with that things like that have happened in the past. And the Chinese are very secretive and sometimes there's corruption and it doesn't go to the purpose it's used for. In India, the corruption's even worse. And that is the worrying thing, that the money could go there and it goes to local fat cats and doesn't get used in what it's supposed to be done.
What steps would you take in order to convince climate change deniers to change their opinion? That's quite a big question.
Well, I think I simply showed them that graph, which is a difficult graph to interpret, where it starts to go down and you say that is showing the amount of carbon that we are putting into the atmosphere. I mean, then they say, well, it's only 400 parts per million. I remember one Australian saying 400 parts per million. He has a pile of sand. He said that's like 1 grain of sand in this whole pile, which is a nonsensical argument because you could equally say that a grain of arsenic in your diet or a few grains of arsenic in your diet make no difference. Well, unfortunately, they do. They could kill you. So you don't need a lot of arsenic to kill you. And the carbon dioxide is an accelerator in the atmosphere. 400 parts per million, yeah, it seems a small amount, but it's enough to do the damage that it is doing.
I wonder why that graph isn't used more. I know you say it's complicated. I don't recall seeing it particularly, and I've studied
No,
it.
I actually, I went on Cambridge University risky talk, and there was a woman there from, there was climate change communication. And I actually sent an email to Cambridge University, hoping it would get to her, saying, look, please explain this and change it round so it's a better interpretation. So at least you see it going up instead of going down. And I think that's a brilliant graph. And I'm really surprised because they constantly say we know what the climate's been doing for, 700,000 years. Some people might say, well, that's the Antarctic. But the air does mix up pretty well for the whole of the world. But I haven't had a response from her. And I think we're missing a trick there because that is such an impressive graph.
Just having a look down the other questions. What legislation could we enact to mitigate the impact of climate change?
I think we should have a system where there's more is charged for electricity and gas, so that there can be more investments in renewables. We just pay more for it. And one of the sad things is that there should also be a higher tax on petrol and diesel. But when the Labour government introduced the escalator, fuel escalator, and it was about to go up, I think the lorry drivers blockaded some of the oil terminals, and Gordon Brown backed down. And a lot of people backed down because the current economy is such that we use lorries to transport a lot of our goods so much that if we do raise the price of diesel, it means that we're all paying for it. But I think we have to. And I think this is one of the inevitable things. We've got to actually make sacrifices, and things are too cheap energy-wise for us at the moment. That's the legislation I would like to see. and also more stringent building regulations so that we can actually get houses that are much more efficient. And that people, for instance, the rules have changed that people don't put up conservatories, which get very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter, and then they can put in air conditioning. Whereas they could,
It's interesting with buildings because they're such a big part of this, but not one that's talked about much. We focus on air travel in general, food as well to an extent, but buildings is not. But you look at all the new buildings and nothing is included in them that's
well, the really sad thing was with governments that pressure groups, when we were looking at the building regulation about 2012, it was predicted, and we were going to have building regulations that all new buildings, new domestic houses in 2016 would be net zero carbon. Net zero carbon. And 2019 for net zero non-domestic buildings. So it's quite easily done, but the government reneged on that because a lot of the house builders said, this will be far too expensive and we won't be able to sell so many houses. We'll have to lay off more people. You'll have to pay more unemployment and things like this. And the government, to be honest, once Tony Blair said, I agree with everything you guys on climate change are saying, but he said, if I put that forward in my policy, we would not get elected. And at the end of the day, it does come down to us, and we've got to get the message out that we've got to do this. It's we've got to be more evangelical and get the facts and the science out to people.
Yeah, just on the buildings and energy. And when we had our extension, we looked at all the renewable options to put on our house, and all of them except solar thermal. But I think PV now is a reasonable price as well. We're way too expensive for one property to invest in. But as a community, we could invest in sort of ground source heat pumps or air heat pumps or wood boilers or whatever else you could do, but we couldn't, no house individually could afford that, but as a street we might, or a village we might. So I don't know where the prospects are for that in the future. Community.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite project. A good idea that if you put PV up and you could get a company to do it for you and have part of the payback. And I think British Gas did that once. They would actually put photovoltaic cells on your roof, but the amount they paid you was just almost like a rental for using your roof. But that is the way that your community get together, and you have a group heating scheme, and you also have group electricity. And they're talking about the microgrids. And you could actually have a system where a sufficiently large area you could generate your own electricity. The only thing is that you've always got to look at what happens if you've got a few wind turbines. And for instance, a school could put a big wind turbine on the sports field. It could have PV on its roofs. But you've got to think if it's a cloudy day without much wind, and then you've got to have the backup. And some people on the environmental side do say that one of the things is have baseload nuclear, and nuclear is cleaner than it was in the past, but you've still got the worry about nuclear waste. So it's not a clear-cut solution.
Yeah, there was a question here about nuclear energy actually, what your position is on that. So yeah, questions around the idea of working from home now, which is good, less travel, but balancing that out with the energies used in our technologies, the minerals and stuff used to create the technology and the laptops and stuff, so balancing out different problems of reduced travel with problems with the technology.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that we stay in our home, and for instance, I've been keeping out of supermarkets and somebody else has kindly been doing my shopping. But you've also got a system that a lot more is being delivered by vans going around. And if we look at the diesel usage, that, you know, we're probably deliveries from shops now as we go online and it's delivered to us, it's going to increase the emissions. So the emissions for the goods we actually purchase are going up. Whereas if we went to the supermarket, especially if we walked there and walked back carrying baskets of the stuff, it would be much better.
Mm.
But
plastic bags as well. plastic packaging.
Yeah, plastic bags. I think that, again, the problem there is that we, being a rich country, have sent all our waste to places like India and China. And they've thought, well, the easiest way is to pump it just straight into the ocean. So we've also got to think of how we treat our waste. And we've got to have more recycling. And we've actually got to pay more for the waste to be dealt with. And not, get these people that say they can do it cheaply and then they just simply chuck it in the ocean.
Question about brownfield versus greenfield developments. Any differences in emissions developments? Yeah, brownfield, greenfield developments.
Yeah, there are plenty of brownfield sites. I mean, I would often think of an example that you probably could have a city which is just one huge skyscraper and goes up and up and up. I mean, in Manchester, the number of skyscrapers that have gone up is enormous. Now, they're probably going to have problems. A lot of people will not wish to go to Manchester, and perhaps that includes some of the students as well. So brownfield, yes, but it's really dealing with the population. People have got to live somewhere, and it's those sites. Now, what is going to happen when we come out of the European Union, and if we go into world trade and there's no agreement, our farmers are going to have a lot of competition from overseas, and a lot of them will go out of business. If we go to a vegan diet, a lot of the farmers in the Pennines have sheep. What are they going to do? Nobody eats any lamb. So the Pennines will then become more forested. Very interesting questions. One of the slightly surprising questions is that, or facts, is that when we were discussing food and the carbon, there's often talk that, oh, you're eating blueberries that are grown in Spain or they've come from South America. In actual fact, the food that's transported that way often is just making up the extra space. So when we put our bags into the plane, there's sufficient space for quite a bit of other goods to be transported. So it's not simply that there's a plane full of food. And we should try and cut down on the air miles of our food. But then it's often poor farmers in developing countries that have got a market there. And we stop that and they would go out of business. They've got to find another market. It's very complicated.
Yeah, similarly
There's
with
no
travel.
simple one solution.
So don't travel by air. Actually, a lot of countries rely on the ecotourism, and without the ecotourism, yes, they'll revert to bushmeat or deforestation or other helpful things. So yeah, it's a balance, isn't it? What are your thoughts on mitigation techniques such as encouraging reflective clouds?
This is big engineering. Again, it's going to be very expensive, and how do you make that cloud in the first place? It depends where the level of the cloud is, and this is one of the problems we had early on in modelling the climate change, because high clouds and low clouds act differently. Some of them keep the heat in, and some of them reflect the heat out. So if you, for instance, you could say that putting sulfur into the atmosphere, just like a volcano, when there have been big volcanic explosions, there has been a period of darkness on the Earth, or darkness relative to when it's clear atmosphere. And it's meant that the crops have withered and so forth. And I think when Krakatoa went off, there was quite a noticeable change in the economy of what happened. There are other things we could do before we do that. And I think that what we've got to think of is that our own materialism and our own desire for things, we've got to see whether that can be limited, and also using renewables that we know work One thing, for instance, is carbon sequestration and storage. We could run a gas-fired power station, and we could take most of the carbon dioxide out of the smokestack. It just makes it that much more expensive. So the energy companies say, well, if we do that, nobody will buy our electricity, which is true. So if there's government initiative that we actually pay more money anyway for our electricity, then we could do more of that. But then the government will be worried that certain companies like Nissan or British Steel or whoever the steel company is might say we're closing down those plants and going to a country where electricity is cheaper.
Mm. I think we've fairly much got down the list of questions in the chat box. So if anybody else has got any points or questions they would like to...
Well, there's one here from Callum. Well, I think Callum's asked a few questions over the time. But there's one here where Callum's put, how can we change this? In politics, there's often the mindset that they can't do something because they wouldn't be re-elected. And that article I sent out about what's happened in Denmark kind of referred to this sort of thing, really. How can we change this and get a fairer, more environmentally active parliament?
I think the thing is that we can, okay, there are protests and things like that, but it's really educating people and trying to get through to people that we've got to have a parliament that will pass this legislation, and that it's in everybody's interest to pay a little more so that we can actually reduce this and to get the facts across. I think there was an excellent question about comparing COVID with climate change. COVID, people can see, they might know relatives that have died. It's in the press. They are aware that they could die within 3 weeks. Whereas climate change, people are prepared to dismiss it. And I think when you look at priorities of people for what they actually vote for, it is actually materialistic and money to start off with. And environmental issues can be quite low down the pecking order. So I think but the younger generation are far more aware of the environment than the older generation. So it's my generation really that, well, they won't be around for too much longer to influence things. That's really for youngsters to be politically aware, be aware of the facts and try and actually do something. I think that never feel that you can't achieve something. Always carry on, because you know it's surprising when you do actually start something. It can be a failure sometimes, or it can be a success and you hit a nerve. I mean, I think with Greta Thunberg, that started off, and surprisingly, it really gathered momentum. And it's we've just got to keep on with that and keep the facts coming and not get too emotional about things. And even if people don't, we just keep the facts and they know. And at least they should have a conscience then that what they're doing isn't for the best good.
On the back of that, I'm going to kind of put this question out to everybody watching, really, all the participants. Do you all think there is enough education around the actual facts of climate change? Does anyone want to answer me on that? Anyone other than Geoff have a thought on that? Do you think there is enough? Go on, Callum. Do you want to unmute yourself? What do you think?
So I think in mainstream education, there's not enough education at all. If you're lucky to do geography, you've probably got some hours of it. But in the actual main curriculum, up until year 9, you only actually encounter it 10 hours. So that's something that definitely sort of needs to change. As sort of an activist, I guess I've had to self-educate myself and read all the reports. So the information's out there if you look for it. It's just not taught to us at an early age.
Yeah, thank you, Callum. Geoff, Callum's a member of the XR Youth in Shrewsbury, so he's quite well read up on a lot of this stuff. But my impression is that in schools, it's taught in the same way year on year on year, and actually I think a lot of youngsters switch off. But then there are those who are very engaged with it, and I think that's what needs encouraging, isn't it? And putting these key facts across.
I think being an educationalist in the universities, one of the things is that when you look at climate change, it's not a question of physics and meteorology alone. It's sociology, psychology, economics, geography. And one of the difficulties is that getting scientists together and actually discussing these things and not really fully understanding each person, because there are some very detailed facts. I mean, we saw the graph there of the carbon-13 isotope against carbon-12. Well, that's detailed chemistry. But also you've got in there photosynthesis and how that works. And then you've got the evolution of the different types of crops that have C3 and C4, I think it is, photosynthesis. And I don't know much about that at all. And I think that's a very good question, that you should try and mix them together. And perhaps this is a case for something like the baccalaureate, that we don't kind of force people to study, you know, just a couple of science subjects and then a couple of art subjects or something, but it's broad, and then people can get a greater appreciation. But at the end of the day, it does come down to this ethics. And, you know, do we think we should try and treat other people in the world reasonably well, rather than us having most of the cake?
Yeah, thank you. Before, we've only got 5 or so minutes. I don't know if anyone's got any other questions they want to ask. They can wave a hand at me if anything else has occurred.
Well, they've been very good questions so far. Keep it up.
Yeah, they're really good. This lot are good, Geoff.
Yeah, thank you very much for very challenging, interesting questions. I'm sorry if my answers haven't been very good.
No, they've been very good, and we've covered lots of different areas. There's another one from Callum. Go on then, Callum.
Come on, Callum.
Yeah, sorry. Initially, when people are hearing the facts about climate change, they can reach the viewpoint, oh my gosh, this is too much, I don't want to hear all of this. What can be done to either soften the science or the messaging, but still keep people engaged?
Well, this is another very good question, actually, because Kevin Anderson, my colleague at university, he has got a very pessimistic view of what we're going to achieve. And sometimes the students would come out of his lectures and feel quite depressed. And it is quite easy to look at these facts and get quite depressed. But I think that mankind has survived and overcome a lot of challenges in the past. And I think every generation has its own challenge. And life without a challenge is not really worth living. And if we look at previous generations, my parents' generation, it was in the war, and they faced death with fighting in the Second World War. And I think that each generation has its own challenges, which you've got to try and address and tackle them. And for instance, one can get pessimistic looking at just the UK, but if one looks at China, and if they just move off of coal onto gas, that's not perfect, but it releases 14% of the emissions. There are things that can be done. It's possible with a bit of effort and people actually having the resolve to do it. A bit like COVID. The government have thrown so much money into COVID, and if they threw a similar amount of money into climate change, and all governments did it, and we divided up the money around the world, that is the answer. But it is something that when you look at it, it can be very depressing. But don't get too depressed, because our brain is a wonderful thing, and every now and again some really great things come along. And sometimes you don't hear about them. For instance, lighting. When I started off as a lighting engineer, we used a tungsten lamp. And that tungsten lamp produced about 10 lumens of light for 1 watt, 10 lumens per watt. We now have light-emitting diodes, LEDs, which produce 100 lumens per watt. They're much more efficient. And yet, The only thing is that there's what they call the bounce back effect, that people think, oh, LEDs don't use any energy at all, or they're very little. So they like to put them outside their houses to show off their houses. And it's quite pointless having all this lighting on. They don't need it. But they think, well, it doesn't use much energy, I'll leave them on. But technology is slowly going along there. And with, for instance, hydrogen and battery technology, carbon sequestration, it can be done. It's getting the facts to people. But keep on campaigning and don't give up. The world's in your hands.
I like that, Geoff. Can I ask one last question before we draw it to a close, which was, what are your suggestions for what these young people here could actually do themselves? Who could they lobby? What organisations could they get involved with that are maybe pushing for better laws, you know, similar to what we read about in the Denmark article?
Well, I think first of all is to get fairly well up on the facts, and always, you know, go to the Member of Parliament and also the other people that would stand as candidates and see what they do and what their attitude is, and help to, you know, get that known and to put it round to colleagues as to what, you know, if there's a certain candidate that's going to be favourable to those things, or a candidate that is a climate denier and that type of thing. And also to make your views known. That some people actually say we shouldn't have shares in fossil fuel companies. But the thing is, you can actually buy one share in the company and you can go to the shareholders meeting and you can raise a few questions there. And really, amongst your peers and that, make sure that everybody knows and that we're getting the facts out, as opposed to what so often happens in politics. It's opinions, and in the papers, it's opinions as opposed to facts. Science and the scientific method are really powerful, and we should respect that. Science is changing. We don't know all the answers. We never will. But if we move away from science and go to opinions and so forth, as populist politicians tend to do, that's, you know, we've got to oppose that.
Okay, there's actually two more questions coming. One from Callum saying, can he ask a final question? Can in a minute. One from Ellie saying, is there anything we as citizens can do locally for climate change? We'll have that, and then one more from Callum.
Well, I think, you know, planting trees, looking at your lifestyle, perhaps becoming more vegan. My son is a vegan and I've been eating some of his food and I quite like it. You've got to be a bit careful on the diet that you don't, there are certain vitamins that vegans need. And I think don't be profligate in your energy use. Cycle and walk, it's healthier when you can, and just be considerate like that. And I think that there's so much that, but it does come down to the fact that eventually we've got to have legislation, because there will be people that say, I don't care about it, it's going to happen in a, you know, at the end of the century, I won't be around. You know, and that's and make them feel ashamed that that is a very bad attitude, and put it in terms of what their children and grandchildren will think of them.
Thank you, I think that's good. Go on, Callum, what's your, we'll make this the absolute last question because it is 5:30. Go on, Callum.
Often when we're talking about climate, Indigenous people aren't talked about, but those are the people that are going to suffer the most. So what can we do to work with people from minority groups and Indigenous people on the front lines to help mitigate the climate crisis?
Well, I think it's getting the money and to get the actual resources for renewables. And you've hit the nail on the head there, Callum. It's the poor that are going to pay the price. I'm living in Manchester. I won't suffer that much with climate change. I might see a bit more sunshine. It might be slightly better for me. But I've got a student of mine, my best student. He's now the energy minister in Burkina Faso. And Burkina Faso is one of the poorest countries in Africa. and in the world. And now they've got, I think, IS going in there and taking over villages where they've got small gold mines and enslaving the people to work the gold mines. And it really is getting the resources to those people and making people aware, and that some of the money that we spend on overseas aid should be to try and make sure that we can reduce energy and getting it through to the grassroots people, because this corruption is the main problem, that it goes in. When I was in India, I was on the university, and it was a beautiful setting, but the river was absolutely filthy. It was stinking, and there was so much muck in there. And the person that had founded this university, a very rich person, I said to him, why don't you get the river cleaned up? He said, well, he said, the problem is that we did put some money to it, and the bureaucrats took most of the money and nothing was done. And that is so, so sad, that you've got to look at the system there, and we've got to find ways of making sure that when the money is spent, it is spent in a good way, and getting it down to the grassroots people so they know what to do and they can do it. And it's appropriate technology as well. You don't put in high-tech stuff, which when it goes wrong, the people in the small village don't know what the hell is happening. But with indigenous people in small villages, you've got the chance with renewables of having some form of microgrid so they can actually get the access, because these people often suffer because they're burning biomass in their homes, and there's a lot of smoke and pollutants around. So a lot of women go blind and a lot of babies die because of the environmental conditions in those homes. And so getting electricity to them is actually going to save their lives and make it a lot easier. And that's what they're doing in China, because a lot of people are burning the fuel in their homes in open fires. So you can't always say that then putting up a coal-fired power station to provide some of the poor people with electricity. But if we could just make it a little more money to them so they could use gas, or they could use more renewables.
That's great. Thank you, Geoff. I'll just turn my video off by accident there. Thank you. That's great, Geoff. Really good. I think we'll stop it there. I think we're all out.
Well, thank you for listening and all the really interesting questions. They've been really good questions, and I'm sorry I've been a bit inadequate on my answers.
No, I think they've been brilliant. Well, we're getting lots of claps. Can you see the screen, Geoff? There's lots of people giving.
Oh, thanks.
It's brilliant.
But as a final word, remember that life is full of challenges, and that's what life is about, trying to overcome these challenges.
Yes, I mean, when that news report came out Wednesday about the in Siberia, the fires there caused by climate change and things, I just thought, oh, but you're right, we've got to overcome it, haven't we?
Yes,
lots of
yes.
thank you through.
And I think the papers are full of doom and gloom, but we are resourceful, and I think that you know, we've just got to use our reasoning and our brain, and it's the latest challenge.
Yes. All right, thanks very much, Geoff. That's brilliant. So just to remind everyone that the recording of this will be on our Shropshire Wildlife Trust YouTube channel. It will probably be middle of next week before it goes on there. Okay, and there's a Growing Confidence playlist, so you can look at some of the other talks. So in about a month's time, in August, we've got another one of these on population growth, which is a very contentious issue, and lots of things to consider.
Yeah, I listened to that one.
Yeah, of course. Come along, Geoff.
Yeah, well,
you
put me in on the mailing list for that one.
You can be an honorary young person for that one and join.
Thank you. Well, some people say I've never grown up.
Exactly. Good.
Who's giving the talk, Kat?
Pardon? We've got someone from the charity Population Matters. We've got a chap called Alistair Curry, who's the head of communications there, I think. Yeah, so it should be good. Hopefully.
Oh, I look forward to that.
Yeah, good. And Dan's put a message on there. We also have a group called Youth for the Wild, which is a bit more informal. Dan giving a thumbs up. And our next meeting with those is on Wednesday evening. We're having a debate about whether or not we should just cancel 2020 and skip straight forward to 2021, because this year's been a bit rubbish. But you could take Geoff's argument that then we're losing these 6 months to fight climate change. If you're interested in any of those, you've got my email address. Email me and I can add you to the details for that and send you out the links for those in the next few weeks. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. It's been brilliant. Go away, enjoy your weekend and start campaigning.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Jenny. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.